It started, as these neighborhood wars always do, with suspicion lurking behind curtains and whispers in driveways. Karen, the self-appointed queen of scrutiny on Maple Grove Lane, had been simmering for months over her next-door neighbor's newly built pool. She hated the splashing, the laughter, the shimmering reflection at night that she swore shone into her bedroom like a searchlight. But more than annoyance, Karen saw an opportunity hiding behind the sparkling blue surface of chlorinated water. Money. The plan formed slowly, like a storm gathering on the edge of the horizon. Karen knew her finances were a mess. Mounting credit card debt was piling higher than the hedges she screamed about every spring. Her insurance coverage, however, offered generous payouts for property damage caused by water intrusion. In her mind, the pool next door was the perfect villain for a fabricated tragedy. If only she could make the damage look devastating enough, she would claim her neighbor's pool had flooded her yard, destroyed her landscaping, and compromised her foundation. The execution required careful but foolish preparation. She waited for a day of heavy rain showers in late spring, when the ground was already damp and runoff was common. Armed with hoses, buckets, and determination fueled by desperation, she doused her yard late at night until it looked like a miniature swamp. She even ripped up patches of her own lawn, dragging muddy footprints into her garage, sprinkling broken chunks of mulch across her driveway for theatrical effect. To the untrained eye, the scene screamed collapse, decay, and water damage. By morning, Karen put on her best performance. She sobbed loudly on her front porch, clutched a phone in her trembling hand, and called both her insurance company and the HOA board. Within hours, the news spread across Maple Grove like wildfire. Whispers traveled through group chats and coffee tables. The pool did it. She's saying the water destroyed her yard. Neighbors, already divided between loving the pool and hating it, eagerly prepared popcorn for the upcoming clash. The insurance adjusters agreed to send an inspector, and the HOA demanded an emergency meeting. Overnight, Karen transformed from the neighborhood's constant complainer into its star storyteller. She repeated her dramatic tale with practiced grief, her property ruined, her foundation crumbling, and her garden washed away, all sacrificed on the altar of an irresponsible pool owner. The word lawsuit hovered just behind her words, always implied, never directly shouted. And for a brief moment, it looked like her story might stick. The HOA president, wary of potential liability, sent a sharply worded letter to the neighbors with the pool, warning that if negligence was confirmed, the consequences would be severe. Karen basked in it, imagining her payday, her debts erased, her triumphant announcement that she had beaten the so-called fun family next door. But what Karen didn't anticipate was the storm of scrutiny rolling toward her with unstoppable momentum. Insurance inspectors were not easily fooled. They were trained to untangle elaborate lies wrapped in crocodile tears. And Maple Grove Lane, though cozy on the outside, had plenty of residents eager to watch Karen fall flat on her face. As the sun set, Karen sipped her wine and stared out across her carefully staged swamp. She believed the stage was set, the drama prepared, the lawsuit inevitable. But what she didn't realize was that her fake flood was filled with gaping holes, and once investigators stepped into her yard, they'd start unraveling her fabricated disaster thread by thread. The next morning would not bring sympathy or checks. Instead, it would bring the kind of scrutiny she had never endured before, and the cracks in her story were already beginning to show. The following morning, when the insurance inspectors arrived on Maple Grove Lane, the spectacle truly began, and Karen, standing tall on her porch in her robe, acted as though her home had been the site of some natural disaster worthy of national headlines. sighing loudly and letting neighbors see her trembling hands clutching the HOA warning letter she had demanded the night before. People were already watching from their windows, some even filming on their phones, but the inspectors were not there for theatrics. They marched directly into her soggy yard, boots sinking into mud that looked far too freshly placed, exchanging quiet glances while jotting notes that made Karen's confidence slip with every silent stroke of their pens. They crouched, tested the soil, and one of them frowned at the unmistakable smell of chlorine hiding beneath the surface, a smell no rainwater in the world could leave behind. And nearby, the pattern of water pooling looked odd, forming unnatural round patches like someone had dumped buckets in the middle of the night. Karen spoke of patio cracks as new destruction, but cobwebs of dust around the breaks told a different, older story. While mulch scattered across her driveway looked staged, a weak attempt to suggest debris overflow. The whispers of neighbors grew louder as the men kept writing, some already muttering that Karen's revenge plan was failing, others laughing quietly at how fast the narrative was unraveling. And still she forced crocodile tears, pointing toward her neighbor's pool like a stage actor in a low-budget play. But the climax of her failure came when the inspectors actually examined the pool itself. The walls were intact, the water line smooth and unchanged, and the surface calm and clear. Not an ounce of evidence suggesting a leak or overflow, leaving no shred of doubt that Karen's swamp was self-made. When they finally closed their binders, their polite nod told the story Karen dreaded. Her false flood had failed to convince anyone, and though they said little, the silence hit harder than insults, because silence carried the weight of fraud reports and legal referrals. By afternoon, the entire lane whispered like a buzzing hive about the chlorine smell and the fake cracks, and the HOA president who had once rushed to her side now avoided eye contact, embarrassed to have been drawn into her charade. And across the street, the pool owners quietly exhaled a breath of cautious relief. Karen returned inside, shutting her blinds tight, her staged swamp slowly drying under the rising sun, but she could already sense what was coming, that once paperwork reached its destination, realistics, her disaster would not be remembered as damage caused by a neighbor's pool, but as a bold attempt at insurance fraud, and soon every eye in Maple Grove would watch the queen of complaints start to drown in her own lies. By the time the inspectors' reports landed on official desks, Maple Grove Lane was a boiling pot of rumors, and Karen found herself cornered in the very community she once sought to control, because instead of sympathy, the HOA now saw her as a liability, and whispers of fraud began mutating into public confrontations at the local mailbox where neighbors told her straight-faced that no one believed her act anymore. The board, embarrassed by their rushed threats toward the Poole family, scrambled to save face by convening a heated emergency session where once stern officials now slammed papers on the table showing that the so-called flooding had no external cause. And though Karen wasn't invited into the closed-door meeting, the rumors spilling out after painted a brutal picture of blame shifting, frantic emails, and plans to distance the association from the ticking time bomb she had become. Neighbors began openly laughing when they passed her house. The association from the ticking time bomb she had become. Neighbors began openly laughing when they passed her house, recalling the ridiculous chlorine mud she tried to pass off as natural, and to make matters worse, the insurance investigators requested her own watering and garden maintenance records, knowing full well hoses had been running in her yard the very night she claimed devastation. At first, Karen tried to regain control by marching out and loudly insisting she would sue the HOA itself for mishandling her claim, but the performance fell flat, especially when a neighbor, who had secretly recorded her that very night dragging hoses around her yard, boasted of having proof ready for investigators if he ever got asked. The unraveling was no longer a slow drip, it was a waterfall crushing her pretenses, because by now the HOA wasn't just worried about embarrassment, they were panicking about legal exposure, fearful that if Karen's fraud attached itself to their earlier accusations, the entire board could fall into litigation too. And suddenly those who once followed her lead were preparing to feed her to the wolves. Late at night, she peeked out from her blinds, only to see neighbors gathered in driveways, laughing in small crowds, buzzing about fines, expulsions, and even police involvement. And though she clenched her fists and muttered about jealous enemies, deep down, even she felt the creeping dread that her carefully staged flood was about to drown her instead. Over the following days, letters arrived at her mailbox, not filled with offers of support, but warnings of impending HOA violation reviews and formal notices from the insurance company demanding further questioning. And as her facade cracked wider, Karen realized she had accidentally sparked something far more dangerous than neighborhood gossip. She had invited both corporate investigators and federal fraud examiners into her life. Yet, stubborn and reckless, she refused to back down, concocting new lies to patch the sinking ship. And in doing so, she unknowingly stepped directly into the trap already tightening around her, because while she thought the game was still in her hands, others were quietly gathering the evidence that would end her reign of manipulation once and for all. The insurance investigators returned with sharper questions, and Karen tried once again to play her victim role, trembling hands clutching fake receipts for landscaping repairs she claimed to have scheduled. But the lies spilled too easily from her lips, and while she rambled, the investigators calmly revealed photographs taken by neighbors that showed her dragging hoses across her lawn the very night of the supposed flood, grainy night vision footage from a security camera across the street capturing her sneaking around in a raincoat while dumping buckets of water over her flower beds. And suddenly the performance collapsed as gasps traveled down the lane and laughter broke out from doorsteps where neighbors had gathered to watch the showdown unfold in real time. Karen tried to scream over the murmurs, insisting the footage was doctored, but the smell of chlorine in her yard, the mismatched cracks in her cement, and the impeccable condition of her neighbor's pool erased any shred of believability she had left. And even the HOA president, now desperate to crawl out of the mess, stood before the investigators, offering access to every HOA file related to Karen, clearly trying to wash his hands of her scheme. The twist that left Karen staggered came when one investigator calmly referenced not just Karen's current claim, but also suspicious past claims submitted for damage after minor storms, patterns of exaggerated incidents filed over recent years that now looked eerily consistent with fraud. What Karen thought was a single scam to pay off her debt had instead lit a spotlight on a history of shady insurance withdrawals she had never expected anyone to notice. And with each page the investigators read, her empire of lies felt smaller, weaker, and perilously close to collapsing under charges that went beyond muddy lawns and fake floods. But instead of backing down, Karen snapped, lashing out at her neighbors, accusing them all of conspiring against her, and in her rage, she stormed off, stomping through her still soggy yard like a cornered animal, unaware that this tantrum had transformed her from an object of ridicule into an active threat that authorities were now determined to neutralize once and for all. By the time a week had passed, the neighborhood no longer whispered, they celebrated. The HOA distributed letters formally censuring Karen for actions unbecoming of the community, a polite way of warning her that heavy fines and removal proceedings were already under consideration. And the insurance company handed her an ominous notice that her claim had been denied and her case forwarded to investigators for suspected fraud. But the twist that shattered her remaining composure came at dusk when police cruisers quietly rolled up the lane, not for her neighbor's pool, not for some imagined flood, but for her, armed with a search warrant prompted by the discovery that she had submitted falsified repair invoices as part of her insurance claim.
The very documents she had flashed like trophies during her porch theatrics. Neighbors crowded the sidewalks as officers entered her home and carried out boxes of papers, computers, and files, and someone even cheered when Karen was seen arguing furiously with officers on her lawn before being ordered back inside. The very same HOA president who once bowed to her rants now stood smirking in the background, relieved to see the community free itself from her suffocating grip, while children who once feared her screaming about bikes on sidewalks now pointed and laughed as her empire crumbled. Yet the greatest twist was still growing beneath the surface, because as investigators dug deeper into her financial records, they discovered Karen's staged flood wasn't just desperation, it was part of a frantic web of schemes she had weaved over the years to cover mounting gambling debts, personal loans, and unpaid credit balances, a spiral far darker than her neighbors had ever imagined. And suddenly, Maple Grove Lane wasn't watching a petty complainer suffer a little embarrassment. They were watching the opening act of a full-blown criminal takedown in motion. In the months that followed, the saga of Karen's fake flood transformed Maple Grove Lane from a quiet suburban street into a community legend, retold at barbecues and block parties with an air of disbelief that one person could dig herself so deep a hole. Because by the time her trial date arrived, she faced not just accusations of insurance fraud, but a stack of charges connected to falsified documents, repeated false claims from prior years, and even obstruction when investigators uncovered her attempt to destroy paperwork before the police seized her computer. The courtroom became the ultimate stage, and while Karen tried to summon her old theater of tears, the jury had already seen footage, photographs, and endless testimony from her very own neighbors, including the unforgettable damning clip of her dragging hoses around at midnight like a thief in her own yard. And when the verdict was read, guilty on multiple counts, the entire neighborhood exhaled with satisfaction, knowing her reign of manipulation had ended in the only place it could: complete humiliation. The twist that cemented her downfall wasn't just the fine, or even the sentencing of probation and restitution payments. It was the fact that her once coveted position as the loudest voice in the HOA had been replaced with endless mockery, her name immortalized in local gossip as the woman who drowned herself in lies. The Poole family, once nearly fined into misery, ended up celebrated, their pool becoming the ironic symbol of victory over Karen's tyranny, while the HOA, desperate to erase the stain of its involvement, ratified reforms that barred a single member from holding overpowering influence again. Karen returned from court shrunken, silent, blinds drawn tight, her empire of complaints utterly shattered, and Maple Grove Lane moved on with relief, though always with a smirk, because whenever water pooled too long in the rain, someone inevitably muttered the immortal joke, "Careful, it might be another one of Karen's floods." And laughter would ripple down the street, a reminder that greed, lies, and arrogance can drown faster than any pool ever could.